morning. Good to be with you this morning. I want to remind you that our evening service is at 5 p.m. and encourage you to come back. Tyler will be bringing us a lesson this evening for this evening's worship service, so I encourage you to come and be a part of that. Last week we finished the final parts of the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus had taught, found in Matthew chapters 6, 7, and 8, 5, 6, and 7. And so we come to, as was just read a moment ago, the end of chapter 7, which indicates that Jesus and his disciples came down from the mountain. And by the way, when we get, if you're in the Sunday morning class here in Footsteps in Israel, when we get to the Sea of Galilee, I want to show you some photographs of a mountain that may possibly be the mountain by which Jesus taught, and just some of the views that are there, and give you some things that might help you to really appreciate what might have been taking place as he said these things from the Sermon on the Mount. And so as he comes down after preaching this great sermon and teaching his disciples, and we saw there at the end of chapter 7 that the people were stunned and astonished by his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not like their scribes of the law had taught. And that's an indication that he taught as one having the knowledge of even greater than their greatest scholars of the law at that time. You think of that Sermon on the Mount, and as I've indicated as we taught it, probably the greatest sermon that have recorded in all of Scripture, taught by the Son of God. And as he comes down that mountain, and after teaching this great lesson, he then gives a visual lesson to his disciples as he comes across a leper. And I want to share with you and talk to you this morning about this experience, this example, this demonstration that Jesus has with this leper as he comes down from the mountain. And I've titled this sermon, "Do You Want to Be Clean?" And as I've indicated, he comes across this leper. Now, if you're not familiar with leprosy, it's an infectious disease that causes severe disfiguring skin sores and can also cause nerve damage. In fact, the modern day version of what's referred to as leprosy is known as the Hansen's disease. It affects about 180,000 people currently worldwide. And so as we talk a little bit more about leprosy, I'll share some things from the New Testament. But let me share with you an experience that I had several years ago, actually many years ago, when I was in service to the Navy. We stopped in a little country called Bangladesh, and a little city called Chittagong. And in Chittagong, Bangladesh, we were there to build houses for the poor. And so as we had some free time, me and a couple of other friends decided to go and explore the town. And we went to this area they called a mall, which I would call a concrete flea market, because it had no doors and it was just all made of concrete. It looked like might look like a parking garage, and had multiple levels and these open storefronts that you can go through. As we were walking through a Bangladeshi, I don't know, is that how you say that? I don't know what the term is. Somebody from the country there of Bangladesh decided to show us around for a small fee, which turned out, I think, to be 10 cents. And so he's walking us around, and he's kind of giving us a tour of this mall area. And as we're walking around, there's a guy that begins to follow us that half his face is missing. And it looks like bacteria of some kind had eaten away at his face, and he's following us along, and he's begging for money. And I have to say to you, I didn't want this man anywhere near me. In fact, I even said something, or I don't remember if it was me or somebody I was with said something about, I wish he would stop following us. And so our guide took it upon himself to take care of or get rid of this individual. And I don't know if that's what leprosy would look like, but I had never seen anything like it before that, and I've never seen anything like it since, where something would eat away at the face of a person. And maybe that's what's referred to as we think about leprosy, because leprosy in Scripture can describe a variety of different skin diseases. It's not just exclusive to what I told you about the modern day Hansen disease. It can describe a lot of diseases that are related to the skin. And if you go back to the Old Testament, there's some law related to how lepers are to be taught. And one thing is very clear: lepers were outcast from the people. They were told to stay away. In fact, if we'll look at it a little bit as we look at some passages of it, they're not even supposed to live with anyone. They're supposed to live by themselves. And the whole purpose of it is so disease wouldn't spread among the people. And so once it was identified as this skin disease occurring, there was this separation or isolation that take place. We can relate to that, right? Can't we? Over the last few years. Now, some of that was directed by God, as we read about in the Old Testament. But as is man's nature, man took it beyond that. And so as we look at lepers in the New Testament, what we find is this idea of not just a physical outcast, but an outcast of society as well. A group of people that were really looked down upon. That's the man that's going to come to Jesus. And I think there's some lessons that can be learned from this example of this curing of this leper and his healing. Four points that I want to bring to you this morning about the healing of this leper. The first point is he recognized he was unclean. If you go back to the passage in Matthew chapter 8 and verse number 2, it says the leper came before him bowing and said, if you're willing, make me clean. He recognized that he was unclean. Now again, going back to the Old Testament, we can see there's a process that God puts in place. He gives the responsibility to the priests, and their whole job, not their whole job, but their job in this area of leprosy is to examine it and determine whether it's a contagious version or whether there's just this limited amount of isolation that needs to take place. But once it's determined to be leprosy, if you look at Leviticus chapter 13 and verse 46, it says that the person that's a leper shall remain unclean all the days which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His place of habitation shall be outside the camp. Don't be among the people. You got to live by yourself. And so along with this terrible disease comes this isolation that has to take place. Here in the Old Testament, it was the responsibility of the priest to identify whether someone was unclean. But this man in Matthew chapter 8, he recognized that he was already unclean. And he came to Jesus recognizing his uncleanness. Now I'm going to relate some physical uncleanness to some spiritual uncleanness, because I think there's some application for us to be made. Let me ask you, maybe you've been around someone or been in someone's home, and I know I experienced this a lot when I was a law enforcement officer and had to respond into people's homes. But you walk in there and there's just this bad smell. And you wonder, how could someone live like that? Well, they become used to that smell, and so they don't smell it. In fact, Febreze not long ago had a commercial out that said that you were nose blind to odors. Maybe you remember the commercials. And their whole purpose of the commercials was to say there's some smells in your homes that you don't recognize, that others that come into your house, they recognize it. And they referred to that term as being nose blind. Now, that's not a word. I know, because when I typed it in, spell check came up. Tried to correct it numerous times. But they make this point about odors that you're nose blind to. We can become blind to these odors that exist when we become used to them. When we smell them all the time, we don't notice them anymore. There's another uncleanness that we can become blind to, and that's sin. We can become sin blind. Blind to the sins that exist. When When does that occur? Well, just like with the odor, sometimes we become used to sin, and so we become blind to our own sin. Just like those odors, though, that can be clearly smelled by others, our sin can be clearly seen by other people. Now, I have to tell you, myself included, we're good at seeing sin in other people. We're so good at it. Not so good at seeing sin in ourselves. We become sin blind to it. We become used to it. Sometimes we make excuses for it. For instance, if we have an anger problem, that's just my genes, or that's just the way that I am. But sin, unlike the odors that you might smell in someone's home, can be very destructive in our lives. And unlike so many that are blind to their uncleanness spiritually, this leper recognized his uncleanness, and so he sought after help. If we're going to be those that are going to be clean spiritually and given examples of God, the first step in the process is to recognize our uncleanness, to recognize the sin that's in our life. I'll stop and pause for a moment and just say that takes some serious self-reflection from time to time. Not just once, but periodically often. To evaluate our lives and determine, do I have sin in my life? Not look out at others and point out their sin, but to look at myself and ask, do I have some sin that I have to work on? Or do I have some sin that I've become blind to because it's just part of my makeup now? That could be a variety of things, but probably the most common in our society today is language. I've had Christians reach out to me and say, how do you stop using foul language? Well, the first thing I share with them, and if you have that problem, I'll share with you, it starts first by controlling your tongue, and then second by controlling your thoughts. You see, what you think comes out of your mouth. So you have to first be able to control your tongue, and then you have to be able to control your thoughts. It's not something oftentimes that can take place overnight, but it is something that can be overcome. And so this first example that I want us to see from this, or first lesson that I want us to see from the healing of this leper is, he recognized his uncleanness. If we're going to be clean, we have to first recognize the uncleanness that exists in our life. The second lesson that I want us to learn from this healing was that he humbled himself. I didn't think of it until about halfway through, but this morning I heard the word humbled in prayer multiple times. I heard men stand up before us and pray that we would be humble. Well, that's the example that we see with this leper. He humbled himself. He came to Jesus and he asked Jesus, if you're willing to make me clean. Notice what it says in verse number 2. It says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, as I mentioned, lepers were treated as second-class citizens in the first century. And we're not told how this man contracted leprosy. We don't know whether he got it from a friend or how he came about getting leprosy. But notice what he didn't do. He didn't come to Jesus blaming other people for his disease. He didn't come to Jesus to say, the only reason I have this is because so-and-so who didn't follow the law came into contact with me, and now I have to be separated from people and I can't be around them anymore. It's someone else's fault. He didn't do that. And instead of complaining about his circumstances or asking Jesus, why did God do this to me? He didn't do that. Instead, he asked Jesus, are you willing to make me clean? It shows a humbleness I'm reminded of the parable that Jesus told of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke chapter 18. Do you recall that Pharisee, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector? They're both praying, and Jesus gives us an illustration of that prayer. And the Pharisee says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers and unjust and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. That's his prayer. Is that our prayer sometimes? Thankful I'm not like that member that just can't seem to come to worship service all the time. Thankful I'm not like that member that's not singing loudly so others can hear them. Thankful I'm not like that member that does X, Y, Z. But the tax collector's prayer was different, Jesus says. He stood off a distance, unwilling to even lift up his eyes, beating on his chest, and says, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. And Jesus says that as you look at that, he'll later say that that man was justified. This leper that comes to Jesus, he humbly approached Jesus wanting to be clean. Instead of demanding it of him and blaming God or others for what took place, he just asked a simple question. Are you willing? Are you willing? Jesus' response in Luke chapter 18, by the way, was, I tell you, talking about the tax collector, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself would be exalted. Humbleness is a trait that we ought to all have. You see, in this process, we just looked at in this process with this leprous man, this leper, he first had to recognize his uncleanness, but then he had to humble himself to ask for help, to get the help that he needed. And again, we're making spiritual application here. I hope you see this. But if we have sin in our life, first we have to recognize it, and then we have to humbly approach the one that can remove it. And sadly, the biggest problem in humanity when it comes to that is pride. Pride gets in the way. We don't like being wrong. We don't recognize we're unclean, or we just don't want to admit it. And so we don't come to him to be made clean. After every sermon, there's an invitation. An opportunity for those who have not become Christians to be made clean. But not just for them. An opportunity for each one of you that are members to be made clean. But you have to humbly approach. Sometimes we're unwilling to do that because of pride. But like this leper, we ought to humbly approach the one who is able to make us clean. Jesus was able to make the leper not only physically clean, he was able to make the leper spiritually clean. And he's able to make us spiritually clean as well. The third lesson we can learn from the healing of this leper is Jesus did something unheard of in Jewish society of that time. The Bible says he touched him. Look at verse number 3, chapter 8. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. He touched that leper. He could have just healed him. We've seen examples of Jesus healing people when he wasn't even present there. He'd send the messenger away and say, go on, just go back to where you're going. It's taken care of. And he could have just said something to this leper and healed him, but instead, not only did he do that, he reached out and touched him. He demonstrated compassion on this man. When's the last time this man had felt the human touch? Imagine that. I got to hug my grandkids this morning. He didn't get to hug his grandkids. I got to hug my wife this morning. He didn't get to hug his wife. And Jesus demonstrated compassion by reaching out and touching him. I'm afraid we've become so disconnected with people that we're not willing to touch people physically. Now, I've seen some of you, you are. To my introverted personality's discomfort. Thank you. But we ought to be willing to touch people. And I shamefully say to you that I didn't even want that man in Bangladesh anywhere near me, no less touch me. By the way, compassion is something that is demonstrated. It's not a feeling. Feeling is part of compassion, but it's not just a feeling. I felt sorry for that man in Bangladesh, but I didn't demonstrate compassion towards him. I didn't even give him the loose change in my pocket. I didn't want him anywhere near me. Have we become that way with those who are spiritually unclean? The world? Do we isolate ourselves from them? Fail to bring them the one thing that can make them clean? The gospel message? It's okay to touch them. You just might help make them clean by introducing them to Christ. It's okay to have compassion on them. And again, compassion's an action word. It's not a feeling word. It's an action word. Showing compassion is demonstrated in how we treat them. Can we demonstrate compassion on those that are spiritually unclean? How about can we demonstrate compassion on those that are physically unclean? We have a project that at this congregation every month. We go down to people volunteer and go down to the homeless shelter to help feed the homeless. Are you one that won't go down there because you're uncomfortable being around the dirty people? We can demonstrate compassion on those who are unclean. If you're a Christian, Jesus showed compassion to you when you were spiritually unclean. In fact, he showed that compassion to you when you were his enemy. He went to the cross when we were enemies with him. We ought to be able to demonstrate compassion like Jesus demonstrated. The fourth and final lesson we can learn from the healing of this leper was Jesus was willing to make him clean. He didn't cast him off as somebody that was just too lowly and not deserving of being made clean. Many in that society had probably done that. We see examples as we read through scriptures of how the lepers were treated by people. Many of them, again, looked down on them, but Jesus didn't do that. And isn't that, if you go to Luke chapter 16 and you read the account there of Jesus talking about the rich man and Lazarus, you remember that? There's a rich man and Lazarus was a leper. And he would sit at the gate of the rich man every day asking for alms. And every day that rich man would pass him and fail to show any compassion for him at all. He wasn't willing to do anything for him. Here Lazarus was full of sores. All he wanted was the crumbs from this rich man's table. And yet he got nothing. Every day this rich man passed by, considering Lazarus too lowly of a person to be worthy of any assistance that he would bring. But then Jesus gives the illustration, or not gives the illustration, he tells us both died, the rich man and Lazarus. And it says that Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom and the rich man goes into torment. Their roles are reversed in death. And you recall in that account that the rich man has a conversation with Abraham. He first says, let Lazarus just dip his finger in a water and touch it to my tongue. Not crumbs from a table, like Lazarus wanted in the physical life, just a drop of water on my tongue. And then his request is, when Abraham says that they can't pass between the two because of the great gulf that exists, then his desire is, well, then send Lazarus back from the dead to my brothers so they don't come to this terrible place. You remember what Abraham's response to him was? He says, even if one were to come back from the dead, they would not believe. They have the law and the prophets. In other words, God has provided in his word all the answers to the questions. And even if someone were to come back from the dead, Lazarus, they wouldn't believe him. The rich man, while on earth, failed to recognize his spiritual uncleanness. He could see the uncleanness of Lazarus, physical uncleanness, but he failed to recognize his own spiritual uncleanness. Perhaps his arrogance of his success led him to ignore the uncleanness in his life. Do we act like the rich man sometimes spiritually? Do we decide who's worthy of the gospel, who's not worthy of the gospel? Who do we want among us? Who do we don't want among us? Those who are willing to humbly approach Jesus and recognize their uncleanness, Jesus is willing to make you clean. We ought to be thankful for that. He's willing. Regardless of how bad you have lived this life and what you've done in your past, Jesus is willing to make you clean. This lesson's titled, Do You Want to Be Clean? Missed that one, sorry. There you go. Do you recognize the uncleanness in your life? Have you done that serious self-evaluation and compared your life to what you find in Scripture? We're pretty good, again, at identifying sin in other people's life. We're also pretty good at ignoring passages that might address the sin in our life. But we ought to do some serious self-evaluation. I do want to share with you that this is true with every sermon that I prepare. The first person I preach to is me. And so I had to do some self-recognition and some serious self-evaluation. Are there things that I'm doing, saying, acting in a sinful way that's somehow keeping me from being spiritually clean? I want you to know there are those here today who are unclean spiritually. Some are unclean because they haven't yet obeyed the gospel and washed their sins away in baptism, and so they're in that unclean state. And some are unclean because they're already washed their sins away in baptism, but they continue to live with sin in their life. John would word it this way in 1 John chapter 1, that if you walk in the light as he is in the light, then the blood of Jesus continually cleanses you from all sin, speaking to Christians. But if you're not walking in the light, if you're walking in darkness, he would say, you're a liar, and you have no fellowship among other Christians or with the Son. So some today who have obeyed the gospel of Christ are unclean because they're not willing to stop that behavior. They want to remain unrepentant in their activities or in their behavior. Some of you may recognize your uncleanness. Some of you may not. Maybe you become used to the sin that's in your life, and so you haven't really sat down and done some of that self-evaluation. You become sin blind to it. But in order to be made clean, you must first recognize the sin and the uncleanness in your life. And then you must humbly approach the one who can make you clean. You have to humbly approach Jesus. We need to remove that pride in our lives and be humble and come to him. Don't let pride, like the praying Pharisee in Luke 16, keep you from Jesus. Understand, that was a man that was praying to God. Jesus says that man's not justified. His prayer was useless. Pride can separate us from God, but be humble and approach him. And then thirdly, demonstrate compassion on others. Show the unclean compassion, both physically and spiritually unclean. Demonstrate compassion. Don't just feel bad for them. Demonstrate compassion on them. There was an idea years ago of producing at the congregation I was at, putting together these bags for homeless people. We had a complaint that we had so many homeless people, we didn't want to give them money to support some habit that they might have, and so they put together these little bags that had all kinds of different necessities in them. And as you drive around and you run across one, you grab a bag and hand it to them. Had little gift certificates for like Carl's Jr.'s or something in it, food, deodorants, and all kinds of different things that might be there. But that's a demonstration of compassion on people, giving to those in need. Not just looking at them and going, they've got a bad habit, I'm not going to support it, drive away. They may. Doesn't mean you can't help them. Show them that they're welcome. Show them that you're not afraid to touch them. And regardless of your uncleanness, Jesus is willing to make you clean. Whether this morning you're a Christian or not a Christian, Jesus is willing to make you clean. Will you recognize your uncleanness and humbly approach him? Will you show compassion? Because he's willing to make you clean. The Old Testament law established how a leper was to re-enter the camp and be made clean. And the process that the leper had to follow to be made clean, part of that process was to be washed. If you were in this morning's Bible class, I shared with you the mikvoth, the immersion pools located at the southern area of the temple complex. Now that was for the purposes of entering the temple, but they had these things throughout the city. And so for a leper, part of that process was to be fully immersed in water to wash that physical stain off of them. We have a spiritual stain, and baptism removes that. And so if you're not a Christian this morning, baptism can help remove the physical stains, the spiritual stains on your body, on your soul, by being obedient to the gospel. You want to be spiritually clean? If you're not a Christian, it includes the act of immersion in water. But if you're already a Christian, there's another process, and it requires confessing that sin and repenting of that sin. It also requires humbleness, identifying that sin. And so if you have that need this morning, whatever your need is, I would encourage you to come now as together we stand and sing with the question, do you want to be clean?